I'm talking here to Dong Gwen, and she just got a prize, the Gerrit van Dijk Science Prize at the Data Center Prize. So congratulations. What is your research about, your PhD?
Thank you. So in my PhD, I look at automatically analyzing and processing language, and I focused on the social dimension of language. So what can we learn about people, about social relationships, about communities by analyzing language?
Okay, so you basically got the stream from data from Twitter, for example. And so did you use the Twitter, or which social network did you use?
I used a lot of Twitter data. I also looked at some other data sources, but Twitter was the main data source.
Yeah, Twitter is fantastic. You get a huge amount of, endless amount. So now you've done language analysis, and what can you now learn about people after? If you would look at my Twitter stream, what could you talk about? What could you tell about me?
So one of the things I did was looking, well, how much does the language that we post online tell us about the identity of people? So can we learn the gender or the age or the location of people by analyzing the language? The conclusion is surprisingly well, we can learn a lot, but of course these models also make mistakes.
Yeah. So what is the male-female ratio prediction?
So the accuracy is around like 88%, but the models, they do tend to learn gender stereotypical patterns because these are machine learning models. They
learn from the past.
They learn from the past, they generalize, and so these models, they work well, but you also have to be careful when you apply them to.
Okay, so that is gender 88%. What about other things like how old I am?
So how old you are, I think, was accurate in less than 4 years. And so the age prediction was on average less than 4 years off, but the model was very accurate for younger people, and it had quite difficulty predicting the ages of older Twitter users. So for example, it's very difficult to say whether someone is 40 or 50 based on their language online.
Yes, I can imagine. Well, other things you can predict about us on terms of the language?
So these were the two main things I looked at, but I also looked at for example, dialect use on Twitter and how that might relate to someone's audience and goals people might have. And I also looked at very different types of data. I also looked at folk narratives data, so urban legends and fairy tales and other types of data sources, to find computational methods to help narrative researchers study these folk tales on large scale.
Yeah. It's still pretty innocent and pretty limited, right? I mean, we just had we had a talk from Kefi about talking about how these algorithms are totally biased and basically take decisions for us. In your research, do you see any angles for that danger?
So in my research, I focus mostly on the one hand, generating new insights about social behavior and language. So in that sense, I try to support social scientists and linguists, for example. But I also try to make these tools more robust. So for example, a lot of the tools that are developed in natural language processing, which is my research field, they work well for old white men, for example, because they're trained on, I'm sorry?
Like me, yes.
Because they're trained on, for example, newswire text. So one of the goals of my research is also to make these tools more robust and to work more effective for other social groups, which I think is a really important goal to have.
To make them less biased.
To make them less biased. Of course, there are also ethical challenges or concerns that you might have. So we use a lot of Twitter data. Twitter data, on the one hand, is public, or it's perceived to be public, but of course not everyone knows that their data is used for research. So that's another question that I always ask myself, whether it's okay to use this data for a particular study that I'm using, and I try to be careful with how I use the data as well.
Very good. If you then, what about your the code and the code you used? What kind of a neural network did you use, and is your information public on your results?
So part of my research that I did was before the deep learning hype. So there I just used machine learning models like logistic regression, or I also used kernel methods. Now in my current research, I'm using some deep learning methods.
Hooray, the neural networks are coming to the surface. Yeah, they're so popular, huh?
Most of the data is publicly available, and the code for some of the studies as well. So I try to make it as open as possible.
Okay. So you have an API which I can use to I throw in data and I can get a prediction male, female, and age out of that.
So there was a public demo of that. I have to say the demo is a bit out of date, so the model's trained on data from a few years ago. So I think it would need to be updated to be effective right now.
So what's your current research?
In my current research, I'm extending this work. So I'm also looking at language and social media, but on more fine-grained levels than the levels that I looked at during my thesis. And I'm also collaborating with social scientists, and I also work on making the tools that we develop in computer science more suitable for social science research, for example. For example, to make them more transparent as well. Yeah.
Hooray. Where do you do this?
So I work at the Alan Turing Institute in London, and I'm also affiliated with Edinburgh University.
Okay. And this prize you just got was for work which you did how many years ago?
So this was for my thesis, which was from 2012 to 2017.
Okay, so it's quite accurate. Congratulations.
Thank you.
Very useful work.